Hi, everyone. Good morning, and great to be back today to continue this conversation and digging into new elements of the future of the cultured meat industry. My name is Kara Nielsen. I am a trend forecaster. WGSN is not a radio station that you haven't heard about. It's actually a UK-based trend forecasting company that started in the fashion space and has expanded across all kinds of consumer areas, including food and drink. So I am the director of our food and drink site, and we have subscribers who are interested in having a sense of where the future is going and how that's going to impact their product design and product development. So grocery retailers, ingredient companies, food manufacturers, and marketing agencies are all our subscribers. So you can imagine they're very interested in these types of topics and how that's going to impact the future of what consumers are looking for and how that is something that's going to help improve their business. So I am very honored to be here today to lead this panel that is also diving deep into sustainability, which is something that WGSN also focuses on very intently. And we just published a white paper called Create Better that looks at sustainability across different industries. And when we were talking about vegan leather yesterday, I thought, well, that's probably somewhere in there. So do take a look. And I am going to let my panel members introduce themselves, and then we'll dive right in. Nikki?
Hi, everyone. Thank you to CMS for having Olive Farms as part of the programming here today. It's really great to be together and to see parts of everyone's faces in the community. And I'm Nicky Quinn. I'm Global Marketing Director of Olive Farms. Olive Farms is a cultivated meat company based in Israel, and our first product will be a thin-cut steak.
Very exciting. So wonderful to be here today. I'm Dr. Kate Krueger, founder of Helicon Consulting. We're a boutique consultancy that focuses on frontier biotech and biotech consulting, especially in the cellular agriculture space.
Hi, I'm Noreen Hobayan. I'm the Director of Quality Assurance and Regulatory Affairs for Blue Nalu. We're a cell-cultured seafood company located in San Diego. Our first product will be bluefin tuna, and we're looking for a product that is healthy for people, sustainable for the planet, and humane for animals. I'm really excited to be here today to talk to you.
So diving right in, when we think about cultured meat, I think one of the first things that people think about, especially from the consumer standpoint, is, well, its reason for being is around sustainability and being able to have a protein source that is more sustainable. But sustainable has started meaning all kinds of things and really touches on all kinds of areas. So it's not just about agriculture, for example, anymore. So I'd like to kick off our panel here to ask each person, what is your company's or your point of view of the most pointed sustainable goal that your company has?
Thanks. So I think I'd like to start off by sharing our company's vision because it's directly aligned with our sustainability goals. So our vision is for unconditional access to quality nutrition for anyone, anytime, anywhere. And I think it's also important to know that for cultivated meat, one of the key drivers is developing a sustainable production system for animal products that addresses issues from food and water security, food safety, ecological footprints, animal welfare issues. There are many grand challenges that we're all trying to address, we have to meet those challenges in order to achieve the 17 SDGs as identified by the United Nations. And in terms of the way that translates to what LF Farms is doing with our sustainability goals, it's two-pronged. So the first thing is our vision for an inclusive transition to a sustainable and resilient meat sector. We also wrote a white paper recently and published it this summer where we go into it in detail, and I encourage everybody to check it out if they're interested. It's available on our website, and I'll just go over the key elements of it right now. So it's important with sustainability that in addressing these problems that the solution addresses and acknowledges the complexity of the problem first and foremost. And that means that there must be multiple strategies acting in concert alongside policy and education. And the first thing in terms of the toolkit that we see coming together is responsible meat consumption and the adoption of healthy and sustainable diets. The second is sustainable livestock agriculture, along with incremental innovation that increases the productivity of these systems. And then transformational innovation, such as cultivated meat, that would really act as a supplement to sustainable livestock agriculture. And unfortunately, we're going to need a pretty significant supplement in the decades to come. So those are what really the top line elements are of our vision for an inclusive transition. And then another prong of our sustainability goals is our carbon neutrality commitment. We are committed to carbon neutrality within our operations by 2025 and within our entire supply chain by 2030. And I think it's also important to point out in terms of how do we define sustainability, because I think a lot of people just tend to think about the environment, and of course that's an important aspect, but as you can tell by what I'm saying is that this is a complex problem. It's more than just about the environment. So we have 4 pillars of sustainability that we advocate for. That includes the environment, of course. It includes economic sustainability. So a sustainable meat ecosystem must be affordable and it must be profitable. Additionally, social sustainability. So food systems should meet the sociocultural needs of everyone. Additionally, during this transition, farmers, we must look out for the prosperity of farmers, either in thinking about how they can be incorporated into these new systems that we're building, or ensuring a just transition. And finally, health sustainability. So we should be making products that are nutritionally accessible, and that address issues of both over and under nutrition throughout the world.
Thanks, Nikki. That really does show the broad elements, and we're going to dig into these points a little bit further. I'd like to pass it on to Noreen to move from land to sea. So when we're talking about Blue Nalu and seafood, what is Blue Nalu's biggest and most focused sustainability goal?
So you're right, it is a little bit different because we're focused on seafood, but I think we have some things in common with what Olive is saying. We also look at sustainability from the point of sustainable development. So in my opinion, that is, we're looking at creating growth in a way that meets our needs, but it's not going to compromise the needs of future generations. So as a mom, that's something that, really speaks to me. So we also look at the different pillars. So, we're not just looking at economic gain, but we're also looking at the social effects, we're looking at the environmental, and we're also looking at the cultural. And for me, and I think for Blue Nalu as well, the definition of sustainability is where you have balance. It's the intersection of those things where we can have the profitable growth, but we can also have balance with the environment and social and other needs as well. And because we are focusing on the ocean, we do focus on the Sustainable Development Goals, but one of them that really I'd like to speak to today is number 14, which is life below water. So in my role at Blue Nalu, I think something that I really appreciate is that I get an opportunity to advocate for the ocean. There's a lot of problems going on that are below water that maybe people aren't thinking about all the time. There's pollution coming from plastics, which someone mentioned yesterday. There's heavy metals and other contaminants in the ocean. The ocean is being acidified. It's warming. There's eutrophication going on, and as a result, some of the fish stocks are declining and fisheries are collapsing. So all the time while this is happening, the global consumption of seafood is very high. The average amount of seafood that people consume is about 17% of their diet, so it represents a significant portion of protein consumption, and the population is growing. But the seafood stocks are not growing. So we're facing a problem where we're going to have a crisis where people who are relying on seafood won't be able to get it. And so we think that our option provides a third option that will relieve the ocean and allow fish stocks to grow and allow people to prosper who are relying on those fish stocks while at the same time supplying high quality protein.
And Kate, you have the advantage of looking at a number of different industries and different protein types. What's a sustainable topic that people might be overlooking or that companies should really keep in mind that hasn't already been mentioned?
Yeah, definitely. So there are a couple that come to mind for me, especially based on these great explanations here from Nicky and from Kara and from Noreen. So I think a couple of the aspects that I'd like to focus on are, one, Noreen's component of balance. So balance is really interesting to me because balance can take so many forms, because with sustainability especially, on the one hand you have the desire to help farmers and to get small communities active and engaged. And on the other, you've got the sustainability goal of building large facilities that are the most efficient and the most effective. So hitting that sweet spot where both we can satisfy the farmers' needs, but also hit those sustainability goals that will likely be driven by big facilities, it's going to be very, very interesting. Another balance point that I think is going to be really fascinating is energy. So it's pretty clear from a lot of projections that water, for instance, is saved in general by cellular agriculture products, most likely. Same with land footprint. But one of those interesting kind of open questions is, what is the energy footprint going to look like? So if you look at the life cycle assessments that have been done in this space, some are very favorable on the energy side of things, some are very unfavorable. And largely, I think that has to do with the fact that we're still figuring out where that will all land. So that's something I think is on all of our minds as these products develop, is just how we can make sure that those energy numbers are as good as possible.
Well, it's been interesting to see how consumers and more everyday people, and especially our younger generations, are so attuned to these topics and are really asking companies tough questions and have very high expectations from food brands, at least. So as this goes out, one of the things that we're seeing are new labeling on packaged food that talks about a carbon footprint. So I wanted to ask any of you of any specific things that you can share that your companies will be talking about. You mentioned carbon neutrality. Nicky, can you give us any more details of what that really looks like? Without breaking any promises or
Right, I know.
your NDA?
Well, I cannot share too many more details about it right now because we're about to share more. I was hoping to get the press release done before this, but these multi-stakeholder press releases take a little longer. So I can't share with you specific details in terms of how we are going to be achieving carbon neutrality, but we will soon. In fact, we see this as something that we need to share, resources that we need to share between companies. I think I think we'll talk about this later in terms of just teaming up together and sharing resources. I think that will be important. So we look forward to sharing our carbon neutrality roadmap in the weeks to come. I can say that we have a couple other efforts that are in line with our sustainability goals, and that includes our space program, All-F-Zero. So a lot of people think space, what does that have to do with here on Earth, right? You hear the knock a lot on recent activities in space is that, listen, we're struggling right here, right now. What does that have to do with our problems here? And from our perspective, it's directly related. So behind the name of All-F-Zero is to produce something with nearly zero resources. I like to say that necessity is the midwife of invention, and space creates the harshest environment you can imagine for the production of food. So it pushes our processes to the brink and inspires creativity that directly translates to our production practices here on Earth for Earthlings. But we also believe that human life should be multiplanetary, and we intend to be the main meat producer on Mars and the Moon. I'm not kidding, it's part of our key markets. And with that, I wanted to share that this week we were announced as Phase 1 winners of the NASA Deep Space Food Challenge, along with our team from Astrius. Space is an environment where there's a lot of collaboration. You need a lot of different types of experts, so we love that, all hands on deck type situation. So excited to share that because part of our ability to do deep space exploration, we run out of food essentially, so we need to be able to grow food in situ. And cellular agriculture is a great application for that. And another sustainability effort that might not be directly in line with carbon neutrality goals, but overall sustainability goals, specifically social sustainability, is our Gen Z program. So like you were saying, the youngest generations are our biggest supporters and advocates, and we engage them as stakeholders, not as consumers. We engage them not only as mentors to help them, show them the roadmap. You know, there's not many programs at these universities for cellular agriculture, if at all. There's like one or two. So they need help in terms of how to get involved. And also, we engage them, like I said, as stakeholders, including co-visioning and co-creating. Think about how privileged we are to be in this room. Who decides who's here and who gets to envision our new food system? So we intend to have an inclusive approach, and our Gen Z program is part of that.
Oh my goodness, I cannot agree strongly enough. I think this is so exciting because these highly constrained environments are exactly where I think we're going to get the most innovation. So I was talking with Nicky a little bit about this backstage because really necessity is the midwife of invention on so many levels. And so we're starting to see this in the space in a really big way. Singapore, of course, is the biggest player currently in cell-based meat. 2 companies and 2 places available already there to eat product. Not to mention UAE, other countries in the Middle East, who of course seeing strong drivers in that space, seem very interested as well. It's just a very exciting time in terms of where people are interested in driving this. And not to mention the next generation, they see these threats more than anyone else. So they are the most constrained generation today. So it's amazing. It's a great time to be thinking about these questions and really engaging with them on a deep level.
So Noreen, I'm not sure if there's anything to go back to carbon neutrality or carbon footprint. We've moved off into space by now, but if you want to speak about carbon and also like how that's going to be communicated. You know, we know obviously that shoppers don't necessarily absorb the sophistication of what's really happening, but the carbon question is starting to be something people understand, and whether it's, you know, carbon positive, neutral, carbon zero. I'm just wondering about this carbon question, whether Blue Nalu is thinking about it and in what terms.
Well, just an interesting fact, you're talking about going to space, and you know, I'm here also to advocate for the ocean. Did you know more people have gone to the moon than they have to the bottom of the ocean? That's amazing. You know, it's 2/3 of the planet is made up of water, and there's a tremendous resource there. People are depending on it for their lives and livelihoods, and we don't understand it as much as we should. But in terms of carbon emissions and our carbon footprint, the place that we like to start is to compare it to conventional. And the conventional supply is very fragmented. It's really difficult to understand what the carbon footprint is there. But there's one thing that we do know about it, that seafood right now is being transported over very large distances to get to the point of consumption. And when it gets there, the yield is only about 60%. So our process, which is, you know, more intensified and it will be in urban centers, we won't have that transportation issue. And when the product arrives, it will be 100% yield. So the efficiency will be much better. But in terms of, you know, our commitments or what we're going to do, it's, you know, very early in our process, and it's difficult. You know, I really applaud what Aleph is doing in terms of their commitments, but, you know, without the process, without a supply chain, it's really difficult to make those commitments, but it's definitely on our radar and something that we consider in all of our decision making.
Not to mention, there's so many considerations we don't have to think about with cell-based meat and cell-based seafood that we think of all the time in the industry. For instance, things like freezing food products. I think most people know this came up yesterday, but most people do not know that all fish must be frozen before consumption. So even that sushi we eat, it's been frozen. And freezing is a very energy-intensive process. So cold chain is a very energy-intensive process. So the more we can reduce these components, the better. So it's really exciting to me, I think, to think about all the points where we can save energy and be more efficient that we don't even think about today. Because, as Noreen mentioned, these costs are so hard to mention. It's just very, very hard to total them all up and figure out what's going on. Most of us ignore certain price points in the chain just because there's so many of them. So the more we can actually quantify that information, the more we can make better models and better predictions for where we can improve things in the future.
So one of the things that I was really fascinated by yesterday, as someone who comes from a food trend space, was, again, all of the deeper understanding of the inputs and then also the outputs of the cultivated meat industry. And we talked yesterday about scaffolds and media and, you know, feeding the cells. So I want to think about, you know, from the sustainability standpoint, you know, the sustainability of both the inputs as well as the outputs, because food waste and how companies are getting rid of things has also become something that consumers are understanding better, companies are really talking about. So I'd love to hear from anyone, this sort of input, the sustainability questions to really keep in mind from the input or the output side?
Yeah, definitely. I think this is a unique point where cellular agriculture can once again really come to the fore in places where you wouldn't expect. So we heard yesterday from Matt Anderson-Barron about future fields and how they're using insects for growth factor generation. And that to me is just one of many, many examples where you can start to think of inputs for waste products being part of a chain that becomes part of a high value product. So if you're thinking about insects eating waste products, for instance, that then can create high-value components that can be used in cell-based meat to make a steak. What a wonderful system, and what a system where we can start to think about savings in terms of nutrition and energy and so many efficiencies we couldn't even dream of before. So yeah, it's a brave new world, and there are all sorts of opportunities that I think we're going to see as we move forward to scrimp and pinch and get much more innovation out of the system than we expected.
I think top line, it's just important to know that that cultivated meat as a production process for beef is overall just much more efficient. And not only that, but we are looking into innovating on the production line level into like reuse and recycling of our media as well to make it even more efficient. But our protein conversion ratio, which I don't know exactly, Netta isn't here, our CTO, I was hoping she would be, but she didn't make it. But yeah, our protein conversion ratio is much higher than that of conventional beef.
So I wanted to steal a comment from my quality world. So my primary responsibility is in quality and food safety and regulatory. And something that we talk about in food safety is the product has to be safe from farm to fork. And I think that the same applies to sustainability, that the entire supply chain has to be sustainable. And at Blue Nalu, we're still developing our supply chain, but we're taking into consideration not just what we're doing within our walls of our plant, but what our suppliers are doing, and as well as what our customers are doing. So we want to make sure that the entire supply chain is sustainable, not just what's happening inside the walls of the plant.
Supply chain, too, is something I think everyone always thinks about, but especially with COVID, where we've got vaccines. The Pfizer vaccine requires minus 80 degrees Celsius temperatures for transport. Moderna, minus 40 degrees transport temperatures. It's just so increasingly clear that the more we can create high levels of efficiency in these processes, the better. So it's a wonderful time to start thinking about these problems.
So I'm going to throw in an ad lib question here of what are ways people need to think about it? So when we say it's great to say we need to think about them, but where can companies turn for inspiration, best practices, and support? So one thing, Kate, we talked a little bit about, what role do governments or other organizations have in supporting this industry? And I know we talked yesterday about some governments and some places in the world are going to be more favorable and more supportive. But from a sustainability standpoint, what would the ideal role of governments and organizations be to try to help this industry kind of get off and start off on the right foot as it grows and scales?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it really depends a lot on context, right? So the context of all of these things is so important because in the US, of course, we have this potentially co-regulatory framework, which looks like it's going to happen. And on the one hand, right, we have these opposing kind of groups that have different ways of thinking about doing these things. And at the same time, we also have groups that are very, very interested in a very vested way in making this happen. So the Government Accountability Office is a really good example of that. They released a report not that long ago that really covers what a co-regulatory framework would look like. They've had a speaker foresight series on this topic. And those are the sorts of reports that are read by the Office of the President. So these conversations are going on at so many levels that are really, really promising and exciting. And I think it's important to highlight that while there are these overall structures which are really important to think about within these systems, there are also people within these structures. And these people have unique interests and goals, and many of them are very aligned with innovation and development in this space. So that's, I guess, the human side to that answer.
I can add to what you're saying in terms of what we see as the role of the government and compare it to renewable energy. In order to see a significant penetration of cultivated meat in the market, the government has a significant role to play, both in terms of policy making and in terms of the alignment of incentives. We'd like to see the discontinuation of the subsidization of unsustainable agriculture. We need to see an accounting for the true cost of food. We need to see a change in the USDA food pyramid, which involves, consumer or diner education. We also we'd like to see significant investment. I think what we saw with Tufts should just be the beginning. We need a tremendous investment by the government for both research and infrastructure that will actually also help them achieve their carbon neutrality goals and food security goals, as we see in countries such as Singapore and UAE and others.
Anything to add, Nicky? Noreen, sorry.
I think you said it very well. I think the government has a tremendous role. I think first is recognizing that there's a looming crisis. That climate change is changing the way that agriculture and, aquaculture and fishing, the food is just not going to be there, and to be prioritizing that in a better way so that we're getting the funding. I think the USDA grant gave $10 million to Tufts, I think it was last week or the week before. That's tremendous progress, but also, as you said, investment in infrastructure. One of our speakers yesterday was talking about how the infrastructure doesn't exist, and it's not just for the cell-cultured meat and seafood industry. It's also the industries that come before and after it. We don't have that infrastructure. We're relying on manufacturing capacity that's in other countries that it themselves have sustainable, questionable sustainability practices, and it's traveling very long distances to get to us. So I think the government really could do a lot more in terms of investing in the research, investing in infrastructure, and also, of course, the policy. I think that they've been very proactive, as we discussed yesterday. We want them to accelerate it to make sure that when we're ready to bring the products to market, that we're able to do so safely and under their guidance. And at the same time, we don't want it to be overly burdensome. So sometimes the regulations can create a barrier, and we don't want a barrier. So we're looking for both cooperation, but also consideration of our. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, not at all. I just wanted to join in because I can't agree more. And I think especially as a consultant that works across industries, not only in cell-based meat, but also in frontier biotech and synthetic biology, it's really clear that the US government is really not as involved in supporting the infrastructure of B2B technologies and a lot of the underlying infrastructure, I'd say, across the biology sector that is not biomedical. Biomedical is wonderful, very exciting, very interesting, but a lot of the tools that biologists use and that biotechnicians use for cell-based meat, for synthetic biology, for a lot of biosynthetic processes that are highly efficient and very good for the environment is not there in nearly the way it is for industries like biomed. And while it's great to cure cancer, that's very, very important. There are a lot of other challenges in the world we face too. And that's something that I always look at is how do we make the tools better for everyone in this space? The tools better for cellular agriculture, the tools better for clean tech, biotech, chemical creation via bioprocesses, which are much more efficient for the environment. So once we support that infrastructure, I think we can start having this conversation on so many other levels where ideally a lot of this efficiency is just a given.
So another theme that really came out yesterday was the theme of working together. And as a nascent industry, when you're certainly thinking about everybody's goal around sustainability, how are ways, or what are some ideas that have been presented, Nicky, I'll turn to you to start, of like how the industry could work together on these sustainability questions, and if there are, again, any examples of, early cooperation or other ideas or imaginations of how that might help, just, focused on the sustainable part. Again, because everyone is going to be having some of these same issues across the globe. So how can the community work together more to tackle some of these, do you think?
Sure. I've been working with sustainable brands for, over 10 years. And the common theme that I see is that founders specifically, or companies, individual companies, feel isolated. They're trying to figure out all these big problems by themselves. And to the extent that we can share resources, like I said, our open source carbon neutrality roadmap that we'll be releasing, I think, is a step in that direction. High tides rise all ships, right? The tides are literally rising, but I think that to a certain extent, sharing resources can be extremely beneficial. And also, let's just say that none of these sustainability goals that, cellular cultivated meat companies claim, it's all potential, it's all speculative, it's all based on the ability for us to scale. So I think, Olive thinks, in addition, there's potential opportunities within the supply chain where we can share resources, and we look forward to sharing more news about that in the months to come, but I really can't share anything further on that topic, but I look forward to following through and sharing that with all of you by the end of the year.
So I think you're right, like combining our resources is very helpful. So Blue Nalu is one of the founding members of AMPS, and in that organization, I'm very active in it, and we're talking about, there was a recent EDF blog that's talking about sustainability and different aspects of our industry, and we're able to join together and talk about that and respond to it and really draw from each other's resources because we're all at different levels. I personally am really excited to be here today, but I wouldn't say that I'm like the biggest sustainability expert in the world, but I'm very passionate about it. So groups like AMPS give us the opportunity to talk to one another and to gain from each other's expertise, which is, really fantastic and, very collaborative. So that's one thing. I think something else that we can do as companies, so this is more like internal to the companies, but within the company is to build the right culture. So really understanding between companies what good looks like in terms of culture inside of the company. I think at Blue Nalu, Lou Cooperhouse is our president. He said to say hi to anyone who knows him. I think probably everybody knows him, so hello from Lou. He really does a great job building a great culture within the organization to focus on sustainability. And I think the reason why I'm sitting here today is a testament to that. I've been with the company for a year, and sustainability is one of the reasons why I wanted to join the company. But since then, I've gone out and got a sustainability certification. I've taught my children about it. We've changed the things that we're doing in our house. So I think that, having those right conversations with your employees will change their behavior. It'll change their corporate citizenship behavior, if you will, the way they behave at work, and it will also start to spark innovation that our industry really needs. I think that's really important. And then I think in the long term, something that we need as a group is to determine what good looks like. So what does sustainability look like for our industry? It's very different from agriculture. It's very different from fishing. And there's sustainability certifications that are out there, but they don't really apply as well because our process will be so different. So I think that we need to work together to define what good looks like in terms of sustainability for cell-cultured seafood and meat.
And when it comes to what good looks like, I think there's an open question around that of not only what good looks like, but who defines good. So is that something that's internal to the industry, which could be a really great answer? Is that something that's external to the industry? I think recent assessments that we've seen from the Delft study and then the counter article that references the Open Philanthropy Project look at the life cycle of these products is very telling in that we don't have common baselines yet, and we don't yet have a group that we go to for that information. So if you are looking for a life cycle assessment that has less bias, where do you go? And that's not to say that any of these assessments don't have value. They certainly do have value, but we live in a bit of an information void. I think a lot of that has to do with how young this industry is and how much we are getting there, because I think there's a lot of desire from all sides to really have that information really drive those conversations forward. But what's that going to look like? So Beyond Meat, some years back, did a really good life cycle assessment of their product. And that's great because we've got an industry standard directly from them. I would love to see that from all companies once they hit a certain size scale, just so we have that internal information from them. Also having a regulatory body that governs this. So an example that I really like comes from the world of tissue engineering. Tissue engineering is great because it's a slightly more advanced field than cellular agriculture in a sense, but it also has very different drivers. So the field of tissue engineering, of course, we're dealing with muscle cells. We're hoping to make things like tissue implants to help people suffering from things like volumetric muscle loss or eye damage, for instance. So these are all very key challenges, and of course there's a lot of biology that's very similar, but as you can guess from the type of work that you're doing in that field, you can have a much higher price point and lower volume of production. So if you're putting something in your body, it needs to be very, very clean, especially if someone is ill and getting that implant. But that said, you don't need much of it at all. So in this space, of course, very different drivers. You need to make a ton of product at a very low price. But the commonality that I do see between those places is a ton of regulation. So one thing that we do see in the tissue engineering space that's really great is how many different governing bodies there are around standards. And that's just so, so key, because when you have various products that must be terribly regulated, that are going into people's bodies in one form or another, you want to make sure they're safe, and you want to make sure that they're consistent. And a lot of that consistency has to do with reporting. So whether that reporting is life cycle assessments or safety standards, great safety paper out recently from New Harvest, the more of that we can get out there, the better. So that transparency, I think, is really going to be what drives the field forward and makes us go from being what's a very young, somewhat disjointed organization and community to something that's very united, very clear, and very positive in terms of its impact on the world.
So lots of good things to think about, and certainly lots of opportunities, and many of these things hopefully will come forth and be born. We touched earlier on this conversation around sustainability from like an economic and a social standpoint. So thinking out further, when we get to more of a scaled cultured meat industry, when we think about sustainability of like the livelihoods of the people who are in the conventional industries, even on a big scale or on these smaller scales. So when we think around the world of communities that make their livelihood from fishing, that are along our coasts all over the world, and obviously the fish collapses has already affected some of that. I think about all the people who are employed throughout the conventional supply chain, and think about where can they find places, or what's that going to look like? And then how can companies think about this from sort of broader cultural and social sustainability? So any thoughts on that? I know we're not quite there yet, but imagining a positive future where we have to think about this.
Well, I think we're a lot closer than it might seem. So one example I want to give, I'm from Boston area right now, and what we see there is the population has collapsed for cod in the North Atlantic. And with that population collapse, you already see businesses that have disappeared. So Gloucester, Mass. is a great example of this. It went from being a very well-off area to a very poor area. And it's not like that was driven by cellular agriculture or by new manufacturing processes. It was driven by some environmental considerations that just happened. The population of fish just disappeared. And so it's not as though in that context that we're taking jobs or various resources away from people, we're giving them back where they no longer existed. And I think as the environment begins to change, as we start to see the impacts of climate change on traditional agriculture across the board, it's going to become clear that we're not taking jobs away so much as giving them back. And what do those jobs look like when we would give them back? So it's quite possible that because of the nature of this industry, we could have a whole lot more tuning of all sorts of different types of processes. So instead of having one type of sushi salmon you have when you go to out to eat, you could, for instance, have a wide variety of different cell types, potentially, that are locally cultivated in all these different areas. Who knows? It could become this bespoke industry in that direction. I think it's really hard to predict. It's really hard to say what kinds of new markets we're going to be able to access, where we can create resources that weren't there to start with.
Do you want to go next?
Sure. Well, as I said when we originally started our discussion, is that we really do see social sustainability as core to our overall sustainability philosophy, and that includes upholding a just transition. It includes exploring, we have what we call also an inclusive business model. So we're looking to integrate into the existing meat ecosystem and looking for synergies and partnerships up and down the value chain, from raw materials to manufacturing to marketing and sales, distribution as well. So overall, we have a very inclusive approach. And you're right, there is, we don't have a crystal ball, which I feel like has been said many times throughout this conference. However, we are currently doing a study on the social impact of cultivated meat. So we're excited to share that when it comes out, and just wanted to emphasize that it's something that we take very seriously.
Noreen?
And to add some things about fishing, I really love how you said it's giving jobs back. I like that a lot. So the commercial fishing industry is wrought with problems in terms of human rights violations of the fishermen and labor practices, and it's well known that commercial fishing is a very dangerous occupation. So I think in terms of social issues and labor issues, I think the bioprocess is arguably much safer and much more transparent than commercial fishing is. And also, I think that because we're providing a third option to provide seafood, that it will relieve the pressure on the fish stock. So like you gave a very poignant example of what happened in Boston, but things like that are happening all over the world. Sometimes it's created from environmental issues, sometimes it's created from excess trolling by commercial fishermen, and then it doesn't leave enough for the local fishermen. So by relieving overall pressure on the ocean, we think that we're kind of, just like you said, the rising tide lifts all boats, that we'll be able to help people whose jobs are already threatened by the environmental crisis. They're also all threatened by commercial fishing. By relieving pressure on the ocean, we'll be able to increase the security for everyone.
So we're getting at the point where it's time to open up to some questions. So if you have questions for the panelists, you can please line up over there. But I have one last question for the panel as people are thinking about that, which is, we've heard a lot, and companies have been accused of greenwashing. I mean, our mainstream conventional food companies, all kinds of companies, this whole notion of saying something or not really meaning it or not being transparent about it, or just trying to calm down consumers with some buzzwords. What should the cultured meat and seafood industry be thinking about to avoid any kind of greenwashing? Where are the pitfalls that people should avoid, companies?
I guess I'm going to disagree with you, because I think this is one of those industries where we don't need to worry so much about greenwashing because it's almost not a thing. We're so different, we're so transformative. We're not going to be on the level of other various industries where you're making a little change here or a little tweak there. The entire field is completely transformative, and I think once we get that product out there and these facilities out there, it's going to be so much more easy to quantify that we're going to be able to see where we can pull down those costs. And it's going to be extremely obvious, I think, to many of us where and how we can do that as the field grows. And so that's one of the many things that gets me so excited about this space, is just how much I think that will change the game around any kind of greenwashing.
Now that's a really positive a really positive
I have a little bit of a
idea.
differing perspective. I would say that I think our industry is susceptible to greenwashing. I think that, well, let's step back and talk about what is greenwashing, right? Greenwashing is when you have a sustainability mission. It's part of your overall mission, but what happens is it becomes the sole mission that you communicate about in an effort to persuade people, and it falsely narrows the conversation, and it could end up alienating various publics, and you can end up losing trust. Cultivated meat companies are for-profit entities, and economic sustainability, it being affordable and profitable, is part of being sustainable. So I think that we have to be careful as we start marketing, as we start trying to win people's hearts and minds, that we don't oversimplify. And in fact, we could end up making an assumption that's not true. There are so many aspects that are so exciting, right, to talk about when it comes to what we do. It's not just about sustainability. So I think that I'm glad that it's a topic, and I would say, just as a marketer, I think our industry could be susceptible to it, and I just encourage everybody to really, consumers are very, very smart, and they really want more than ever to be able to trust the people that produce their food. They want people to say who they really are, and be who they say they are, and not reappropriate the language and imagery of sustainability in a way that misconstrues their intentions. I think that we are the only cultivated meat company with a head of sustainability. We are the only cultivated meat company with a carbon neutrality commitment. And I'm almost confused personally as to how that's the case.
All right, well, thank you. Noreen, did you want to add something? And then we'll go to questions.
Well, I was going to point to the same issue with trust. And I think it's really important that when we do make commitments, and I applaud you for the commitments that your company has made, that they mean something, and that we're able to back them up with data. So I'm really a proponent of developing standards. Of course, I'm in the quality department, but some kind of a sustainability standard so that we can back up whatever we put on our label, whatever we're saying about our company, that it really means something in terms of a real impact on the environment.
Great, thank you. All right, love to turn to some questions here, and I will just say this, I don't hear very well, so be sure you speak into the microphone so we can all hear.
Hi there. Ben
done.
Richardson with Upside Foods. First, thank you for that rich discussion. It was really interesting. I was hoping maybe each of you could comment on how you approach uncertainty and navigate ambiguity, specifically as it pertains to life cycle analysis and really accurately understanding the future of sustainability for these products.
Anyone want to jump in?
Sure. I think that's a great question. I think Noreen just hit on it in her last answer, which is standards. Standards are going to be very, very important, and that's going to ideally govern a lot of this. Standards and regulation. Between those two, ideally we'll have people that are required to come in and report particular metrics for these different companies that are the same across companies as much as possible. Obviously, there's variation here and there. You can never be 100% sure about everything, but the goal of standards adoption and regulating bodies is to make sure that enough of that is done that you can compare apples to apples. And that work has not really gotten there yet in this space just because the industry is so young. I firmly believe that as we grow, it will become something that is not only called for, but required. And that process, I think, is going to give us a better handle on the situation altogether.
So I'd like to speak to that too. So we are in our infancy, and I think like yesterday, the scalability discussions were very honest and open. We have a challenge there. We don't know what we don't know in terms of sustainability as well, but we have to be committed to understanding what our impacts are all the time. Starting as soon as possible with LCAs. Just like there's a lot of TEA work, there needs to be a lot of LCA work, and it needs to continue to evolve as we grow. As we learn more, as we're informed more, understanding what the levers are, and acting on it.
Thank you. Another question?
Hello, my name is Jules Madigan with the All Protein Project at UC Davis. And there's a lot of students and young people in this space that are drawn to cell agriculture because of environmental sustainability. So I think, first off, it's awesome that these conversations are happening by some industry leaders. But when we talk about carbon neutrality and greenhouse gas emissions, we know that like fuel and energy are considerably larger impacts than even agriculture itself as a whole entity. And bioreactors are very energy intensive there. So I guess my question is, do you guys view this as a major barrier for sustainability in this space? And if so, like what's being done to address those high energy emissions of bioreactors, which are critical for a lot of these cell ag products?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm going to change the focus of this question a little bit and blow it up past cellular agriculture to say that I think cellular agriculture is part of the solution. And the other parts of that solution, I'd say, have to do with other technologies and different types of bioreactors. So bioreactors, we talk about them a lot in the cellular agriculture space, but bioreactors are also used for cultivation of a variety of other biological organisms, such as methane-eating bacteria and others. So I think it's really important for us to think about not only what we're doing in this space for reducing inputs and outputs, but also how we can change the equation across the board. So if we're looking at a situation where, for instance, we have more renewable and sustainable energy that can then be used as an input for cellular agriculture, and at the same time look at facilities where we're using, for instance, methane-eating bacteria to create fish food, which then can be used to feed existing fish populations and potentially stock cell lines for cellular agriculture companies, who knows? These cycles just get bigger and bigger, and the ways we could have synergies also get bigger and bigger. I think it's just going to be more important that we get the incentives aligned such that this happens. So that's going to likely occur at the governmental level. Ideally, at a lot of different levels, people are going to insist that we have systems that make sense. So I'm all for it. I hope it's on the horizon, and onwards and upwards.
I would also say that renewable energy will be key. I can't share any further details about how that will apply with olive farms, but shortly we'll be able to share that. But yeah, renewable energy will obviously be critical.
Awesome, thank you.
So I don't see it as a barrier, see it as a challenge, and I think that renewable energy is the solution to it. So we're putting plans together for our plants into the future, and it's completely renewable energy.
Hi.
Hi, I'm Larissa Rudenko. I'm formerly from the FDA, and I currently run a small boutique consultancy, and I have an affiliate position at MIT as well. I've been working in emerging biotechnologies for my entire career, and I won't tell anybody how long that's been. But I don't have brown hair anymore. I think that, first of all, I think all of you ladies have hit on wonderful points and expressed them in an eloquent and elegant kinds of ways. And I think one of the things that well, I have 2 points to make. The first is we're really focusing on challenges. And part of the issue with challenges is understanding where you are in the lifeline of the technology and the products you're looking at. So I completely agree with you, Kate, that we need some standards. The question is, what do we get standards for, right? So when we talk about regulatory systems, often we're most used to thinking about regulation of single entities, a protein here, a scaffold there. We're not used to talking about whole foods unless we look at examples like the Aqua Advantage salmon, where the entire animal was considered. So how does one assess the safety of a cultured food? What does one do to set standards for something that's a mixture of cells? What if you have more than just adipocytes or more than just myoblasts or stromal cells? Do you really want to be setting a standard today for what the meat of tomorrow is going to look like? Okay? So that's one really important thing I'd like you to think about. And I'm not arguing that standards are not needed. I'm talking about how one goes about that in the most intelligent and collective and collaborative kind of way. And the second point is that we are used to thinking about things and regulatory systems from the US perspective and possibly Singapore. But we also need to understand that we have to have international, if not harmonization, then at least international recognitions of the kinds of regulatory barriers and challenges that exist. And again, that brings us back to single entity, which is not that hard to do. We know how to do single entities, but we're not really good at looking at whole foods. And because we assume that we've eaten them forever, right? So if you want to talk about animal welfare, Charolais cattle are much prized as a really tasty meat in Europe. But their offspring are so large that the moms need C-sections. And yet nobody talks about animal welfare issues there. So I think it's important to bring all of these kinds of things into the conversation and to remember that our challenges are more than the challenges we see in front of us today, but they are the challenges that steps today will drive for the products of the future.
Thank you for bringing that into the conversation. And this is such a great place to be thinking about the future. And one last question on sustainability?
Hi. I thought those are great questions, and I just want to make a plug for the safety conversation later on, because we're going to talk a little bit about that. But hi, I'm Kim from Vario Advisors, and I have a question to follow up on the standards as well. So when companies go public, they often have to release annual reports, or expected from their shareholders to do so. And as part of that, they would have to do things like reporting, so GRI, SASB, those kind of standards, and aligning with like the Sustainable Development Goals with the UN. Do you know of any companies in this space that are already kind of aligning with those, thinking about the future, doing any sort of reporting according to those standards?
That's a great question, Kim. So I'm gonna turn that question back a little bit to you, Kim, and also you, Larissa. You are some of the most knowledgeable regulatory experts in this room. So everyone should talk to Kim and to Larissa because they are real experts. I'm so glad we had the panel yesterday with our former lawyers from the FDA and the USDA, also wonderful experts on this topic. But I would recommend anyone who's interested in these questions should talk to Larissa and also to Kim. I'm also going to reflect the question a little bit back to the New Harvest Safety Paper, which just came out a couple of days ago. In fact, I shouldn't really call it the New Harvest Safety Paper because it's the industry safety paper. I think it was over 50 companies in this space that participated in the writing and the production of that paper. And it really shows that people are coming together in organizing bodies. I remember some years ago when I was research director at New Harvest, one of the things I was really interested in is how NIST and the National Academy of Standards in the US work in partnership with a lot of groups internationally, such as these System Internationals that are focused in Paris and around the world in terms of getting standards in a lot of the biomedical space. So there are a whole bunch of different standards that are very abstruse that very few people in the world know about, but if you specialize in a very certain area of biomed, for instance, most recently some of their standards that have come out are around things like flow cytometry, if that rings a bell, people that sort cells. So a lot of these micro standards, I think, are going to be extremely key because there are going to be so many micro standards in the cell-based meat space. We have so many different components to this process that things like NIST may get involved at some point, maybe not as NIST, but as some other organizing body, not to mention these international groups which then groups like NIST and others work with. And these are great organizations because companies then have a vested interest in getting involved because they want to be part of these standards. They want to comply. They want the standards to be something they can comply with well. So in that way, it ends up being really synergistic, also really complicated and really slow because that's what goes with synergistic processes that work well for people. That's the downside, but it's early days. I do think the safety paper is one of those first indicators that we're on track, and hopefully there's more of that to come.
Well, it looks like we're just about at time. If there aren't any extra questions, I just want to thank everybody and thank the panel for sharing so many great ideas from land, sea, this outer space, and I think we're going to have to start saying outer space, because space sometimes I'm like, space, you mean how much space you need? But outer space, I love it. This was a interplanetary conversation today. And I look forward to what the panels are going to be next year and how far we're going to get and how these sustainability questions start getting answered and how the group's going to work together to really keep solving these really knotty issues that absolutely have to be solved. So thank you very much, everyone, and thank you for your attention today and for those of you streaming.